According to recent industry research, over 70% of enterprises say cyber and IT risk profiles are increased across over the past 2 years. Not because more attacks alone, but because there's greater system complexities, AI-driven automation, non-human identities, and expanding regulatory accountability for executives. My name is Paul Nashawaty. I'm the practice lead for the AppDev practice, and I'm joined by Bryan. Bryan, how are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me. Bryan Sacks. I'm a field CISO here at Myriad 360. I've been in cyber for over 15 years. My background spans consulting. I did cybersecurity strategy at Deloitte for around 5 years. Practitioner at multiple places. Most recently as senior director at Eli Lilly and Company, but was also the CISO for the state of Indiana for 2.5, 3 years with interim. And then I've been working in the global systems integrator resale space kind of on and off for about 5 years, helping clients select the right technologies, execute on strategy. From a Myriad perspective, we help our clients make sense of that complex IT security. There's 50, 60 tools that the average organization has. So helping them select and acquire the right technologies, but then also sticking with them and helping them implement it and optimize it.
Well, Bryan, it's great to have you here. Your perspective is going to be great. I can't wait to get into this conversation because, of course, from a cyber perspective, from a CISO's perspective, these are very important topics. Enterprises are racing towards automating more of their IT and security operations. They're also looking to refine who builds, secures, and ultimately is accountable for these systems. More generalists are being hired in IT and cyber, shifting left mentally where IT and non-developers are developing more code and workflows, and non-human identity, as we mentioned, is a really big part of it. So Bryan, I'd love to hear your perspective from what's driving the shift and how does it change organizations to build, secure, and operate these modern systems?
Yeah, so from what I'm seeing, it's not really maybe companies suddenly loving generalists, but it's the scope of a lot of these jobs have exploded in terms of what they do. And part of it's because systems are more connected, they're more automated, but they're also more abstracted. And so people are naturally ending up owning a lot more than they used to. And I see this a lot with clients, someone who just used to own identity security or email security, they might own identity, insider risk, vulnerability management, add on, right? Not because they want to, but because a lot of the things, touch everything else now. So at the same time, a lot of the work that used to be specialized maybe isn't that hard to replicate anymore. So, one example might be at Deloitte. When I worked there, a lot of, new guidelines would come out for NIST, let's say, and you'd have to do some authoritative control mapping. It's really kind of complex work. But now that you take that task with Gen AI, generalists can actually knock a lot of that out, assuming they understand, generally speaking, what they're looking at. And you see the same thing on the IT side. So you see companies like Salesforce, they've talked about cutting back on traditional developers. Microsoft has said, I think a couple of weeks ago, something like 30% of their code is AI generated. So it doesn't mean engineering goes away. It just means that some of that job changes. And so once you add in that agentic workflow into the mix, people that have a good understanding of the process and how that system behaves, that's where a generalist might be a good fit. And I think that's probably why you're seeing a lot more organizations kind of map more towards that type of role.
Yeah, Bryan, we're seeing from our research, 67% of organizations are hiring generalists over specialists, not really because they can't find, they don't want to hire a specialist. They just can't find the specialists in a lot of these cases. But to your point, Microsoft you were saying that Microsoft had 50% of their code, or 30% of their code being generated by AI. We're seeing in our own research that from August, we're seeing that 50% of production code is being generated by AI. And that just is expanded probably substantially in the last 6 months. So we'll see, hopefully in the 2026 research, we're going to see what that says. But let's talk a little bit on the shift left mindset. It goes far beyond developers now, with the IT and non-developers participating in code and agentic workflows. What is the risk in opportunities that that are introduced here?
Yeah, shift left used to be about putting security a little bit earlier in the pipeline. And I feel like it's kind of taken on a whole new meaning over the last few years, where it's a little bit modeled more of like a movement. How can I take anything that I'm doing and can I pass it off to a resource? Maybe it's less expensive. Maybe it's a less expensive human, or maybe it's automation. We've been doing that for years. So one of the classic examples is like a self-service password reset. So first identity teams, then help desk was drowning in tickets. And so we shifted that work to automation, right? In the case of developers, what's different now is that the shift left doesn't stop at developers. Non-developer and IT admins can actually do some of the coding or agentic workflows, because there's that, we kind of talked about it, a little bit of the layer of abstraction between some of the technical skills and then the outcomes you actually want to achieve. So the people closest to the process, they can automate it themselves. And that's a really nice opportunity. On the other hand, yeah, there's definitely some risks. Agentic workflows aren't just automation. So traditional automation has input and then an output, but a lot of these agents that run on the machines, there's risk in the actual identity side themselves, but then there's also a risk of what that thing is actually going to do in the output that it can generate. And then maybe one more is just data. So people don't know always where the data is flowing and where it's stored, how it's getting reused. You add in some of the new attack patterns that people aren't necessarily aware of, like prompt injection, for example, or data poisoning. Organizations just aren't built to handle some of that yet.
Yeah, you're touching on a number of good points here, right? When we look at agents and agent development, I mean, this allows for the non professional developer to create applications, right? It allows for the lines of businesses to create applications. So you touched on a couple of points already here. The explosion of these applications that are happening, that means that these lines of businesses have to be regulated and compliance and secure. And accessing the other point that you hit, which is data. Historically, systems of record, these monolithic or siloed data sources, they were protected in a way that those silos protected them. Once you extract that information out, now you lose those compliance regulations and governance kind of abilities that those siloed systems had. So you could actually be exposing data to the wrong sources. So as these agents, these these AI agents and APIs and automated tasks are working more, non-human identities are, as we said, are exploding, right? We're seeing that the agent piece of these workers are doing the job. So why is non-human identity risk becoming one of the biggest problems, the biggest blind spots in security today? I mean, you'd think that people would know about this because it's an access. It's been talked about all through 25. But what should leaders be doing differently?
Yeah, it's still a blind spot, unfortunately. Almost all identity tooling in the past has been built based off a human using it. And so, in my opinion, frankly, we haven't really solved the human identity problem yet. Like for the last 20 plus years, identity meant people. You create a user, you give them access, you hook them up to SSO for some of their applications. Ideally, you're adding MFA across all of that now. If they're on the administrative side, you're probably adding privileged access management, maybe some just-in-time access if you're on the more advanced side. But even all of that's very difficult, actually. You have over-provisioning in many cases. You have role-based access that gets a little bit messy, and some of the reviews are very difficult to do. People are still using legacy Active Directory, so you get that group sprawl, right? And then you add in non-human identities when we haven't even solved human identities, which are exponential. You might have 10 to 20 non-human identities for every human, but I've heard as much as 50 plus per human identity, and those are authenticating all the time. And so you've probably heard the phrase that, attackers don't break in anymore. They log in. They don't break in, they log in. And so stealing some of these non-human identities, if it's done, it's a lot quieter and it's a lot easier to miss than what a human might. It's pretty easy for me to say, this person doesn't normally log in at 2 a.m. or impossible travel. It's much harder when this machine identity is kind of authenticating all day, every day.
Yeah, and I think that can increasingly become a challenge for many organizations, especially with traditional systems. So new systems that need to be put in place, new kind of belts and suspenders have to be put in place in order to check this authentication and login ability. I think that the more complexity of these logins that are being put in place, that's really it's to one extent, it's slowing down productivity, but to the other extent, it's actually creating the ability to access that information. Like as we're hearing about that data lakes and data pipelines are really becoming more foundational, right? Especially when you think of things like observability, it's not just analytics, right? So you have to have an understanding what's going on with the entire ecosystem. What does this mean, and how do you think it changes the way teams are dealing with detecting issues, especially understanding the system behaviors and response to an incident time in real time manners? Like that, it's actual insight that really matter here, right?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, data lakes are really foundational now to observability. And teams have kind of realized now that it's a little bit of the hardest part too. That's why you see some of the top OEMs like a Palo Alto, CrowdStrike, they're all investing heavily there. And you see it a lot actually in the EDR space too, mainly because that analytics is definitely going to tie directly into some of that detection and response capability, right? Having the right data in the first place. A good way to maybe see some of the difference with your traditional like SIM model versus that data lake underneath it is to maybe just look at an example. So like say an attacker uses a stolen service account. So with SIM, you might ingest some of those authentication logs. Maybe you trigger that alert for a known pattern and you correlate a few related events. So the analysts, hey, they know something has happened. They know login from a new location, but they're missing some of that context, and some of the retention's limited, right? It's expensive in a SIM. It's tough to answer some of those basic questions though. Is it from a behavioral perspective, is this normal for this account, or has it happened before? What's the actual blast radius if I have this account being compromised? But if you use that same example with that data lake first, plus the SIM, then you have, perhaps months of data from the identity, cloud, endpoint, telemetry. And so you can baseline some of that behavior, and you can go back and ask new questions of that data. And so in this example, maybe the analyst can say, hey, this account normally touches these services, and today it touched completely different ones. And that started exactly at this, change in December or whatever it was. And then these other identities are showing the same pattern. So now you understand what happened. It's kind of like having a security camera recording footage versus like a smoke alarm or smoke detector, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a good analogy. I like that. There's, you mentioned earlier the number of tools we see in our research. That's 75% of respondents indicate that they use 6 to 15 different tools for observability. And that tool sprawl is also causing some challenges because 54% of the respondents in that same study indicated that they're in favor of a unified view, because one of the things that comes up, and it's directly related to where we were going with the data lakes and information, is there's new regulations and new governance being put in place all the time, right? In particular, they have things like, the FedRAMP and the federal space, but you also have things like the EU CRA that's going into effect. These are challenges that application developers have to run into, right? And there's significant fines, right? So we see that these new and emerging regulations are really putting more personal accountability on senior executives to the tune of where they in extreme situations could serve jail time if they don't comply. So like these new compliance for cyber and technology really are being put in place to mitigate that risk. So how do you see this reshaping board level conversations, and what do you think executives should be doing?
Yeah, like being a CISO wasn't already tough enough job, right?
Right.
So yeah, now you see SEC, there's NIST2, EU regulations, ton of growing, personal accountability. So, but to be fair, it's not just a CISO problem anymore. Luckily, I think these are extending into all the senior executives and board members. So just saying, oh, I don't understand cyber, it's not really going to be an excuse for board level folks. So I think that changes the tone a little bit too of those board level conversations. They're expected to assess cyber risk and document decisions and show and demonstrate how they're actively governing it. And I think that forces that shift from maybe a technical update to an actual risk discussion, even though some of those board sessions are maybe short on cyber. But so the biggest thing that leaders need to do is just to be board ready. And that means, can you translate some cyber risk into business terms, not necessarily just tools, but what's the actual business impact?
Yeah.
And of course, that just starts with preparation, understanding the makeup of the board, committees, what they're after, and then of course having a really solid understanding of what the business is trying to do and achieve in 2026 and beyond.
Yeah, it's here. I know that there's a lot that we talked about during our, during the session here, but this is such a huge, complex challenge for many organizations. Where do you think the audience can go to learn more about this? I know that I have research, but where would you recommend them go to understand more about what we're talking about today?
Yeah, I mean, selfishly, I might just say they should contact us at Myriad 360, but we have a lot of these conversations on a daily basis, and we have workshops and assessments as well. They're welcome to follow kind of our newsletters. We put out a ton of content every week regarding these type of topics. And then we also have a lot of disruptive tool conversations as well, right? These aren't all what we talked about. Are not all standard tools. There's definitely newcomers in the market. And so we have our engineers and architects researching that as well.
Yeah, well, Bryan, there's definitely a lot here to consider, a lot for the audience to think about. And they're already thinking about it. Even regardless where they are in their own maturity curve, they're still trying to figure out how to either get a better maturity posture or just even enter, right? Which is a big factor. So I do appreciate you joining me today. Your insights have been, I think, spot on, especially when we look at some of these challenges. And I encourage the audience to reach out to you. And a big thank you to all of you who've tuned in. We do appreciate you being part of the AppDevANGLE community. But for now, that wraps up this episode. But we'll be back next Wednesday with another conversation diving into the tools, trends, and talents shaping the future of application development. So whether you're deploying at the edge, building with AI, or modernizing your cloud stack, we've got you covered. Be sure to follow us on social. And if you have any thoughts, questions, or just want to connect. Until next time, stay curious and stay building.